So picture this for a second. You see a massive crack in a building's foundation, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The structural inspector comes out. He shines his flashlight on all the rusting rebar, and he just gives you a verdict.
Structure unsafe.
Exactly. It is purely empirical. I mean, it's totally binary. You're looking at measurable physics.
Right.
But when you try to apply that exact same level of diagnostic certainty to a human civilization.
Oh, good luck.
Right. When you're trying to figure out why a massive, like, seemingly prosperous society is just suddenly rotting from the inside out, that structural inspector's manual is completely useless.
It really is. You're instantly swimming in these deeply murky waters trying to decipher, a million invisible variables.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome back to another deep dive, by the way. And today we are looking at an exegetical text that claims to have actually found that structural manual for human history.
Which is a huge claim. We all crave that diagnostic manual,
Yeah.
We want an objective checklist to tell us why a nation fails.
We do. But traditionally, we just settle for historians arguing over complex socioeconomic variables, usually decades or even centuries after the dust has settled.
Yeah, we rarely feel like we have a real-time predictive physics for societal collapse. But the sources we're diving into today, a highly analytical breakdown of Surah At-Tawbah, specifically chapter 9, verses 85 to 89 of the Quran, they attempt to provide exactly that.
And I want to set the stage for you listening right now, because if you're expecting a standard, passive theological commentary about the afterlife, you need to completely recalibrate.
Definitely.
Because the framework presented here argues that societal collapse is as predictable as physics. It completely redefines the concept of hypocrisy. It presents this devastating critique of the modern self-made myth, and this is the crazy part. It treats archaeology as a rigorous, empirical science of moral history.
Not just an academic hobby.
Exactly. So what is our mission today? It's to understand this overarching theory of civilization. We're going to explore the mathematical difference between just simulating a belief system and doing the friction-heavy work of fighting for a just society.
And to understand how the building falls down, the text insists we first have to put the people causing the rot under a microscope.
Right, the termites in the foundation. And the text begins this diagnosis by completely redefining a term we throw around constantly, which is the hypocrite.
The Arabic term used in the text is the munafiq.
Right. And in modern parlance, if you or I call someone a religious hypocrite, we almost always mean it as this binary of internal sincerity.
Yes. We mean they're secretly an atheist or they privately reject the faith entirely, but they're putting on a public performance just to, fit in or gain favor.
Exactly. Like they're just faking it.
Right. The classic definition relies entirely on that internal versus external contradiction. But what's fascinating here is that the exegesis we're studying takes a profoundly different, much more structural approach. The author argues that hypocrisy in this specific Quranic context is not about secret disbelief at all.
Wait, really? So they actually believe?
Yeah. These individuals are actually perfectly comfortable with the belief system. In fact, they thrive on the aesthetics of piety. They are deeply committed to the prayers, the fasting, the community gatherings, the verbal declarations of faith. The rituals don't bother them at all.
Okay, so then where do they hit a wall? Because obviously they're doing something wrong in this framework.
They only hit a wall when the belief system stops being a personal meditation and starts demanding real-world socio-economic friction.
Oh, I see.
The text notes that the munafiq short-circuits the exact moment the religion demands that they align their actual business affairs or their wealth or their social standing with these divine laws of justice.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to picture this. It's basically like wearing the team jersey, right?
Right.
You memorize all the stats, you show up to every tailgate party, you scream the chants.
You're the biggest fan.
Yeah, but the second the coach asks you to actually step onto the field and take a hit from a 250-pound linebacker, you suddenly have a sprained ankle.
That is exactly it, because the bleachers demand no friction. Rituals provide immense psychological comfort and social status, and they cost very little.
Wow.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that it's a fundamental clash of values. The hypocrite desires the social capital of being perceived as the moral pillar of the community.
Right, they want the respect.
But they fundamentally reject the material sacrifices required by genuine ethical character. When the socio-economic system demands they surrender their excess wealth or step out of their comfortable social circles to, dismantle an unjust institution, panic sets in.
So what do? Because they don't just say, no, I'm not doing it,
Yeah.
right? That would ruin the image.
Exactly. They invent what the text calls tawilat.
Tawilat. Okay, let's translate that into action for listener. Tawilat essentially means complex rationalizations, right?
Yes, it's the invention of intellectual loopholes.
So in a modern context, this is the person who says, I would love to pay higher taxes to fund social programs for the impoverished, but the government is just so inefficient with capital allocation, so I am actually doing society a massive favor by routing my billions through this offshore tax haven.
That is a perfect modern equivalent. They use pseudo-intellectual, even moral-sounding language to build an impenetrable fortress around their own hoard.
It's weaponized excuses.
Precisely. They do not openly rebel against the ethical demand. Instead, they use the vocabulary of the system to excuse themselves from the obligations of the system.
I'm exempt because I have this very nuanced interpretation.
Right. They create incredibly nuanced interpretations to explain why they, specifically, are exempt from the sacrifice. And the author highlights how corrosive this is over generations.
How so?
Well, this mindset shrinks a revolutionary, society-altering framework down into a harmless set of personal habits.
Oh, man. It completely declaws the religion.
Yes, it turns a structural demand for economic justice into just a private feeling in someone's heart.
If you were listening to this on your morning commute, think about how pervasive this is in corporate culture, too.
Oh, absolutely.
It's the company that paints its logo in rainbow colors for a month, or they put out this beautiful, tear-jerking press release about environmental sustainability.
The aesthetics of morality.
Right. But the second they are asked to actually sacrifice their profit margins to meaningfully lower their carbon emissions, they suddenly have a 50-page legal brief explaining why it is not currently feasible for their shareholders.
It's the faked sprained ankle on a corporate level.
It really is. And the text points out the internal consequence of this behavior, right? It breeds what they call characterlessness.
Yes. Character, in this framework, isn't a static trait you're just born with. It's an active muscle. And it's forged purely through the friction of making costly choices.
So if you never make the costly choice.
If you continually rely on tawilat to avoid the struggle, you don't just fail a moral test on paper, you physically erode your own ethical spine. You become hollow.
Which brings us to the inevitable, glaring contradiction that anyone living in the real world notices.
What's that?
Well, if these hypocrites are avoiding all the hard work, if they are constantly dodging the draft of societal struggle, why are they the ones driving the sports cars?
Ah!
Why do the guys faking the sprained ankle seem to run the entire league? Because verse 85 of Surah At-Tawbah tackles this exact optical illusion, right?
It does. It directly addresses the illusion of wealth and influence. Verse 85 explicitly warns the observer not to be dazzled by the wealth or the offspring of these individuals.
Now, I have to stop you there, because the warning against being jealous of someone's children feels oddly narrow if we're talking about these grand macroeconomic theories of civilization.
It does sound strange to a modern ear until you contextualize the socio-economic reality of the ancient tribal world.
Okay, lay it on me.
In that era, having many sons wasn't just about a big, happy family. It was the equivalent of raw physical power.
Like a private army.
Exactly. It meant you had a built-in militia to protect your trade routes and enforce your will. And the exegetical text brilliantly translates this concept into its modern equivalent. Today, the Arabic word used there, abana, or benin, represents your political faction.
Oh, wow. So it's not just kids.
No, it's your network of corporate lackeys, your PR team, your lobbyists. It's the mob or the posse that insulates a corrupt individual from the consequences of their actions.
It's the entourage.
Exactly, the entourage.
So everyday people look at these powerful figures, people who clearly utilize bribery, exploitation, and this deeply ingrained hypocrisy, and they experience a profound crisis of faith.
Because they're winning.
Right. They look at the private jets, the political immunity, the untouchable status, and they think, if the system is supposedly just, and these people are morally bankrupt, why is the universe rewarding them so heavily?
And the author details a very specific psychological trick used by these elites to maintain that illusion of legitimate success.
What's the trick?
These corrupt elites will periodically donate a mathematically insignificant fraction of their ill-gotten wealth to highly visible charities.
Of course they do.
The text uses terms like niyaz or zakat here in a corrupted sense. They'll fund a hospital wing or they'll host a massive gala for a marginalized group.
Right, the classic PR move.
Exactly. It serves a dual purpose. First, it buys them immense social respect, tricking the populace into revering them as benevolent philanthropists.
Look how generous they are.
Right. But crucially, the second purpose is internal. It soothes their own cognitive dissonance. It's a mechanism of self-delusion to convince themselves that they are fundamentally good people.
It's reputation laundering, but for their own soul.
Beautifully put, yes.
But the text pivots incredibly hard here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because it states that this massive accumulation of resources and this sprawling network of lackeys is actually a punishment, an azab.
Yes.
The Quran is arguing that this wealth is a heavy burden that is actively sinking their ship.
The framing is completely counterintuitive to our modern capitalist sensibility.
Okay, I have to press you on this because honestly, it sounds a bit like a coping mechanism.
How so?
Let's be brutally real for a second. Crying in the back of a mega yacht, surrounded by a private security detail, is still exponentially better than crying in a studio apartment while facing eviction.
That's the reality of the physical world, yes.
Right. So how does the text actually prove that being a billionaire with an entourage is a literal, tangible punishment and not just some sour grapes philosophy for the people at the bottom?
That is the exact pushback the text anticipates.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And to answer it, the author separates the concept of punishment into two distinct categories: an internal rot and an external systemic inevitability.
Okay, walk me through the internal rot first.
Internally, hoarding wealth through exploitation requires a total destruction of genuine human empathy. It forces the individual into a state of relentless paranoia.
Because everyone wants what you have.
Exactly. They become entirely disconnected from reality, surrounded exclusively by sycophants who value the resource, not the human being. Their psychological baseline becomes one of constant, exhausting threat assessment.
You literally can't trust anyone in your life.
Right. But more importantly, the text points to the macro level, the systemic inevitability. Accumulating wealth unjustly creates massive instability.
Because the math doesn't work long term.
Exactly. It hollows out the middle and lower classes, creating a deeply unequal society that functions like a powder keg. Their hoard is the very mechanism setting up their inevitable, humiliating downfall in the physical world.
The weight of the gold is what breaks the ice they're standing on.
That is a perfect way to phrase it. Historically speaking, the guillotine eventually arrives when inequality reaches a mathematical breaking point.
So the downfall isn't some mystical lightning bolt from the sky.
No, not at all.
The text is arguing that this collapse is an empirically observable law of history. The system snaps because it physically cannot sustain the weight of the hoarding. But if this downfall is an inevitable reaction, where is the proof? Which leads us directly to the concept of Surah At-Tawbah.
Right.
And this concept treats archaeology not just as a study of, old pots and ruined walls, but as the core philosophy of history.
This represents a breathtaking intellectual shift. The author strongly refutes the common assumption that the Quranic stories of destroyed nations, like the ancient empires of Ad, Thamud, or the pharaohs, are just bedtime stories.
Or just simple, boring chronologies of ancient kings.
Exactly. The text argues they establish a profound, rigid philosophy of history. To put this in perspective, think about Hegel's philosophy of history.
Okay, remind me of Hegel's take.
Hegel viewed the progression of history through abstract dialectics, the clashing of ideas moving humanity towards some ultimate realization of spirit. It's highly theoretical and, honestly, sometimes detached from strict moral mechanics.
Right, it's very abstract.
But the Quranic argument, according to this exegesis, is far more material and ethically deterministic. Historical events do not happen haphazardly, nor are they just the shifting winds of abstract ideas. Nations fall due to specific, measurable structural flaws.
Meaning, the Roman Empire or the late Bronze Age civilizations didn't just collapse because of a string of bad luck or a random invasion.
Yeah.
They fell because the internal rot, the economic exploitation, the oppressive class systems, the characterlessness of the elite reached a critical mass. The rot is mathematically predictable.
Precisely. And to prove this, the text points to the specific Quranic command, Siru fil ard, which translates to travel the earth and observe.
Travel the earth and observe.
The author insists that the Quran was demanding the rigorous science of archaeology centuries before the academic discipline formally existed.
That's wild.
It is a divine command to go out, dig up the dirt, and look at the physical, empirical evidence of collapsed systems.
I have to share the anecdote from the source material here because it perfectly captures the absurdity of ignoring this empirical command.
Oh, the Chilla story, yes.
Yeah. So the text tells this humorous, biting story about a so-called spiritual leader who decides to perform a Chilla, which is a 40-day deep meditation retreat.
Right.
He locks himself in a pitch-black room, closes his eyes, and after 40 days he emerges and announces to his followers that he has successfully practiced Siru fil Ard.
Because he traveled the earth in his mind.
Exactly. He claims he traveled the entire earth with his eyes closed through pure spiritual vision. And the author of our text just relentlessly mocks this guy.
As he should.
He insists the text meant physical, exhausting travel. Put your boots on, open your eyes, look at the physical ruins. You can meditate your way to historical literacy.
That anecdote is so funny, but it highlights a tragic historical shift in religious thinking.
Yeah.
Moving away from empirical observation and scientific inquiry and settling for passive mysticism. The author is arguing that those physical ruins are the ultimate, undeniable proof that immense wealth and massive military might cannot sustain an inherently unjust system.
The ruins are the receipts.
Exactly. If a society is built on exploitation, it will eventually leave ruins. That is the empirical lesson of the broken columns.
It's like looking at the black box of a crashed airplane, but you are analyzing the debris field of an entire empire.
The framework conceptualizes this as Sunnatullah, the law of God, or the law of nature.
Right.
The text uses a rigorous scientific analogy to explain the rigidity of these historical laws. Think about the mechanics of combustion.
Okay.
If you put fuel, oxygen, and heat together in an enclosed space, you will get an explosion. It is an immutable law of chemistry. You cannot negotiate with the chemical equation.
You can't just ask the fire to not burn today.
Exactly. And the text argues that the laws of societal physics are exactly as rigid and unforgiving. If you mix systemic economic injustice, the hypocrisy of the elite, and a lack of shared ethical values,
And then you add the spark of time.
the reaction is absolute collapse. You cannot cheat the equation of history.
Man, that is a deeply clarifying way to view the modern news cycle. So, if the historical law, the combustion engine of collapse, is that exploitation destroys nations, what exactly does that exploitation look like in its raw form?
Right. How do we spot it?
Yeah, how do we identify the fuel before it ignites?
Yeah.
And the text points directly to a specific economic mindset. The author uses this theological premise to launch a devastating critique of unchecked capitalist accumulation.
It really does. The exegesis critiques the very core premise of the modern economic narrative. It relies on the archetype of the wealthy merchant, in the Quranic context, someone like Qarun.
Okay.
This represents the individual who stands at the apex of a massive financial empire and claims, I earned every single piece of this solely because of my own intellect, my unparalleled business acumen, and my unique individual skill.
It's the ultimate, unadulterated declaration of the self-made man. I did this all by myself.
Exactly.
But the text framework effectively argues against this self-made man myth by starting with a really basic biological and sociological reality. Human beings are born into this world with vastly different natural capacities. We have different levels of cognitive processing power, different physical stamina, different predispositions to disease, and wildly different geographical and social starting lines.
That's not a level playing field.
Not even close. Someone is born brilliant, perfectly healthy, and into a network of generational wealth. Someone else is born with a chronic illness in a severely marginalized zip code.
And the logic of the text flows directly from that unequal starting point. Since nature, or the divine, distributed these baseline talents and environmental advantages so unevenly, the massive surplus of wealth generated by utilizing those talents does not purely and exclusively belong to the individual.
Wow.
The high IQ was a gift. The stable environment that allowed that intellect to flourish was a gift. Therefore, the excess harvest generated by those gifts inherently belongs to the wider ecosystem.
If you're listening to this right now, consider how radically this challenges our daily assumptions. The text is literally stating that your endless energy or your razor-sharp instinct for market trends was a starter pack you were handed for free.
You didn't earn the starter pack.
You won the genetic and environmental lottery. Therefore, you cannot turn around and charge society a massive exploitative premium just for utilizing a tool you didn't even earn.
And this leads the author to a radical redefinition of social welfare. The text explicitly emphasizes that providing for the deprived, the marginalized, and the poor is not charity.
It's not charity.
No, because the entire concept of charity implies that the giver is doing a noble, voluntary favor. It establishes a toxic psychological hierarchy.
Right. The benevolent, powerful rich looking down upon the grateful, submissive poor.
Exactly. Instead, the text defines this provision as the deprived person's constitutional right. The Arabic term used is haq.
Hack.
It is their rightful legal share of the societal surplus.
That shift from charity to hack changes the entire power dynamic. It completely removes the ego from the equation.
Yes, it does.
It's no longer, I am so generous for giving you a fraction of my wealth. It becomes, I am structurally obligated to return the portion of the wealth that naturally belongs to you.
Right.
And the author highlights what happens when a society rejects this. When individuals hoard their wealth, adopt a hyper-individualistic stance and say, I am an island, I owe nothing to anyone, they strip the civilization of shared values. And the text specifically zeroes in on that word, values.
Because values act as the invisible mortar holding the bricks of a civilization together. When you dissolve those shared ethical values and replace them with pure transactional greed, the text argues that human beings regress to a purely animalistic state.
How so?
Well, if the only driving goals of a complex civilization are eating, drinking, acquiring premium shelter, and hoarding physical resources.
Well, it's pretty much the modern dream.
Right. But if that's it, then there is no functional philosophical difference between that society and a pack of wolves fighting over a carcass. The relentless accumulation of wealth, stripped of ethical distribution, literally unspools our humanity.
It shifts the burden of care entirely away from the whimsical, ego-driven world of billionaire philanthropy, where a few individuals decide who gets clean water or medical research based on their mood, that quarter to a rigid structural system of justice.
Yes.
It demands a baseline where human dignity is a right, not a reward for winning a rigged economic game.
But this creates an inevitable collision course.
Oh, for sure.
If the system is currently rigged to benefit the hoarders, and this philosophical framework demands that we unrig it to establish hack, what happens when the actual call to action is made?
Yeah, how do the people profiting off the rigged system react when forced to choose between their comfort and this structural justice?
Which brings the exegesis to verses 86 and 87.
Right, because nobody who is dominating a rigged game wants to hear the whistle blow. When the command for active, friction-heavy struggle comes, the text talks about the al-Tawl.
The people of means.
The wealthy, the highly capable, the influential. And their immediate instinctual reaction is to petition the leadership for an exemption. They literally say, let us stay with those who sit behind.
They want a doctor's note to excuse themselves from the burden of history.
Exactly.
And the text utilizes a brilliant, incredibly granular linguistic distinction here to reveal the depth of the Quranic Arabic and the psychology of evasion.
I love this part. Break down the linguistics for us.
So the author points out that Arabic is deeply evolved to describe its environment with hyperspecificity. For example, Arabs have hundreds of distinct words for a camel based on age, gender, use, and beauty.
Hundreds of words just for a camel.
Yes. Jamal might imply a strong, handsome camel, while Na'aka refers specifically to a she-camel. Because the language is so highly descriptive, true synonyms, words that mean exactly the same thing without any nuanced psychological shadow, are incredibly rare.
So every specific word carries the distinct weight.
Exactly. Applying this linguistic precision to the verses reveals a devastating psychological profile.
Okay.
There is a general word used, al-Qaidin, which simply translates to those who sit or those who stay behind.
Okay, al-Qaidin.
Now, this umbrella group legitimately includes people who are genuinely sick, the frail, the elderly, the physically disabled, people who literally do not have the capacity to join the physical or financial struggle. They are al-Qaidin.
Right, the people who have valid reason to sit out.
But in verse 87, when describing these wealthy, capable individuals who petition for an exemption, the Quran intentionally uses a completely different word.
And that word is al-Khawalif.
Yes, al-Khawalif. This is a crucial pivot. It refers specifically to those who choose to stay behind.
The choice is the key.
Exactly. It implies individuals who are hiding among the comforts of the home front out of sheer cowardice and selfishness, despite possessing the physical ability, the abundant wealth, and the social means to contribute.
They are the highly capable who opt out.
Right. They prefer the absolute safety of the rear guard over the necessary risk of the vanguard.
And the consequence for this act of cowardice, for choosing to be one of the al-Khawalif, is where the text gets truly chilling.
Because the punishment isn't external?
No. The text says their hearts are sealed. The Arabic phrase is la yafqahun. Because they constantly, habitually avoid the struggle for justice, they literally lose the cognitive capacity to understand truth.
This touches on a profound reality of human psychology and cognitive dissonance. Apathy physically rewires your epistemology.
Epistemology meaning how you process and understand truth.
Exactly. Our brains are highly plastic. If you continually refuse to step up, if you constantly rely on those tawilat, the rationalizations we talked about earlier, to protect your hoarding, your brain must protect its own ego.
Because you can't live with the constant realization that you're a coward.
Right. You would go mad. So the brain justifies the inaction by twisting your perception of reality until you can no longer even recognize what is right and what is wrong.
The seal on the heart isn't magic. It's not a spell.
No, not at all.
It is the natural biological consequence of sustained moral evasion. You lie to yourself so often to avoid the friction of justice that you permanently shatter your own moral compass.
You render yourself incapable of comprehending higher ethical values because understanding them would require you to admit your own failure.
Wow. Your punishment for refusing to see the truth is that you eventually become genuinely blind.
Now, we have spent a significant amount of time analyzing the pathology of the hypocrites, the hoarders, and the al-Khawali.
A lot of doom and gloom, yeah.
But the exegesis does not end on a note of despair. It transitions to the cure.
Right. How does the text describe the believers who actually step forward when the call is made, defying the urge to stay behind?
This brings us to the crescendo of the framework. Verses 88 and 89 describe the prophet and the true believers, and what defines them structurally is that they are the ones who strive with both their wealth and their lives.
They don't just write a tax-deductible check.
No.
And they don't just offer thoughts and prayers from the bleachers. They put their physical safety, their social standing, and their financial security on the line. They have absolute, uncompromising skin in the game.
And the author makes a vital, paradigm-shifting distinction regarding their ultimate reward. In many modern interpretations of religion, and even in certain secular ideologies, the end goal is often framed as salvation.
Right, escaping hell.
Exactly. The underlying idea is that the goal of human existence is to escape punishment, or to eventually achieve a state of passive, stress-free nirvana, just resting on a cloud.
But the text argues that the Quran does not offer salvation as a mere escape hatch.
No, it offers what is called al-Fawz al-Azeem.
Al-Fawz al-Azeem, the supreme or ultimate achievement.
This is an active, dynamic concept. It is not about sitting passively in paradise, completely detached from labor. It is about successfully building a civilization, a Jannat, which literally translates to a garden or paradise.
And gardens require tending. They require work.
Yes. It's characterized by permanent freshness, lush greenery, and continuous, sustainable growth.
So the true reward of striving isn't just an eternity of rest. The reward is that human potential and the very scope of human free will continuously expand.
You don't hit a stagnant finish line where history ends.
Right. The reward for enduring the friction of building a better world is the capacity to experience even greater, more complex levels of human flourishing.
Which forces us to ask perhaps the most important question of all. What is our end goal? What are we actually building toward?
Yeah.
The text views human life not as a passive waiting room for the afterlife, but as a vital, active project. The believers are not fighting merely to get out of trouble with a divine judge. They're actively fighting to construct an evergreen civilization.
A society where humanity's physical, intellectual, and spiritual capacities can reach their absolute zenith without being crushed by the weight of exploitation.
It's a vision of endless dynamic progression, fueled entirely by the sacrifices of those willing to strive.
We have covered immense, dense territory today. We analyzed the anatomy of hypocrisy, discovering that it is not about secret disbelief, but about the refusal to engage in the friction of justice.
We dissected the illusion of wealth, seeing how the entourage of the corrupt is actually an internal rot and a mathematical guarantee of systemic collapse.
We explore the absolute necessity of archaeology, of Siru fil ard, demanding that we look at the physical ruins of history to prove that the laws of societal collapse are as unyielding as chemistry.
We examine the text's rejection of the capitalist self-made fallacy, recognizing the profound argument that surplus wealth must be redistributed not as an ego-driven charity, but as a constitutional right, or haq.
And finally, we look at the stark psychological divide between the al-Tawl, those who hide from struggle until their moral compasses are biologically sealed shut, and those who risk their wealth and lives to achieve al-Azeem, the active construction of a thriving, evergreen civilization.
It is a sweeping, unyielding framework for understanding human behavior and the arc of history.
It really is. And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought experiment to mull over.
Oh, I'm ready.
The text we study today relentlessly emphasizes the need to study the physical ruins of past empires, the broken pillars of Rome, the buried ziggurats of the ancient world, to understand the immutable laws of societal collapse.
Right.
But you and I are living in an increasingly digital, interconnected era. So what are the modern ruins we should be observing?
Oh, that's interesting.
Are the abandoned social media platforms or the crash and burn crypto exchanges where billions in hoarded wealth just evaporated overnight? Are they our generation's broken pots?
That's a great question.
Do those digital ghost towns hold the exact same ancient warnings about human greed, exploitation, and the characterlessness of the al-Khalif that the physical ruins of the pharaohs do?
Well, the structural inspector would likely say yes. The rebar is rusting in the servers, too.
Exactly. Something to keep in mind next time you scroll past a crumbling digital empire. Keep questioning the narratives you're handed. Keep looking closely at the historical evidence, whether it's a physical stone or digital code, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.